Alex is 38. By most conventional measures, he is exceptional, genuinely, not performatively so. He codes fluently in 4 programming languages, speaks with a contagious enthusiasm about emerging markets that makes specialists want to continue the conversation, and in any room he enters, there is a quality of energy that makes people naturally orient toward him. He has started 4 companies. The first lasted 14 months before he found himself, as he later put it, mysteriously unable to care about it anymore. Not burnt out, just suddenly and completely detached from a vision that had felt, 18 months earlier, like the most important thing he had ever done. The 4th dissolved last spring. He has not started a 5th. He has been in 6 relationships. Each one began with what the other person later described as an intensity that felt singular. Each one ended not in catastrophe or betrayal, but in a gradual recession. Alex would begin to feel like the walls were closing in, not because anything was wrong, but because something was becoming defined. He never stayed long enough to find out what was on the other side of that sensation. He is not cruel. He is not superficial. He reads widely, thinks with genuine rigor, and is consistently surprised when people tell him that what he experiences as freedom feels, from the outside, like abandonment. His most recent therapist told him he had a fear of commitment. Alex received this as accurate and found it completely insufficient. It named the symptom without reaching whatever was producing the symptom. There is something beneath the fear, something more structural, something that predates the specific experiences of exit, and he has been circling it for years without finding a framework that actually reaches it. This is something archetypal, a pattern so old that mythology encoded it in recognizable form long before analytical psychology had a clinical name for it. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. Jung borrowed the phrase Puer Aeternus, Latin for the eternal youth, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, where it appears as a name for a god associated with ecstatic renewal and the perpetual beginning of things. In analytical psychology, the Puer Aeternus refers not to a personality type or a developmental stage that some people fail to pass through. It refers to an archetype, an inherited, universal pattern of the collective unconscious that, when it dominates a person's psychological life, produces a specific and recognizable constellation of characteristics. The Puer archetype is organized around one central theme: the preservation of unlimited potential. The preservation of the position of always about to begin. The horror, for someone in whom the Puer is dominant, is not failure. Failure simply means beginning something new. The horror is finitude, the irreversible, the moment when a choice closes other choices and the person becomes, definitively, the one who stayed rather than the one who could have gone anywhere. Jung introduced the Puer concept in Volume 5 of the Collected Works, noting its connection to the divine child motif, the young god who never fully descends into the mortal condition, who retains access to the heavenly realm, associated with flight, with possibility, with the perpetually not yet formed. In CW Volume 5, this motif appears as an archetypal image of the psyche's capacity for renewal and for the refusal of limitation. CW Volume 5, Section 393. The Puer identified individual is typically not unintelligent or unaware. Alex is emphatically neither. The Puer produces a compelling kind of brightness, enthusiastic, generative, full of ideas that arrive with genuine force, coupled with a consistent inability to inhabit the consequences of those ideas over the duration that any real consequence requires. Marie-Louise von Franz dedicated an entire volume to this archetype, drawing her central analysis from Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, itself an almost perfect literary encoding of the Puer situation. The Little Prince travels from planet to planet, genuinely present in each encounter, but never staying. He can feel the value of connection. He cannot sustain it. Von Franz was explicit that the archetype carries genuine and valuable qualities: the spontaneity, the vision, the resistance to deadening routine. The problem is not the qualities themselves. It is the identification with them to the exclusion of everything else. To understand the Puer archetype's specific grip, why it holds with such consistency across decades of apparent self-awareness, it is necessary to understand what commitment actually represents in the psyche. Every genuine commitment is, at the level of psychic reality, the death of alternatives. When Alex commits to a company, genuinely commits, past the honeymoon of the initial vision, into the territory where the work is no longer exciting, he is closing doors. Not metaphorically, psychologically. He is accepting that time is finite, that choices foreclose other choices, that the self who stays is necessarily a different self from the one who could still become anything. For someone in whom the pure archetype is dominant, this is not experienced as a reasonable trade-off. It is experienced as something closer to annihilation. Because the pure's identity is constituted almost entirely by potential, by the felt sense of standing at the beginning of an infinite number of possible lives. The moment of genuine commitment is, from inside that identity, the moment the identity dissolves. It does not feel like an addition to the self. It feels like the subtraction of the self. This is why the pure's behavior appears, from the outside, genuinely inexplicable. Alex is not fleeing a specific danger that analysis can locate. He is fleeing the moment when the relationship or the company would become the thing he actually is, rather than one of the things he might become. Von Franz described this as the pure's deepest unconscious fantasy, to remain in a kind of eternal gestation, always arriving, never quite born, perpetually on the threshold of the definite without crossing it. The pure archetype has a structural counterpart, what Jungian analysis calls the senex, from the Latin for old man. The senex archetype organizes psychological experience around the themes the pure most resists: structure, duration, the patient acceptance of limitation, the willingness to be known rather than merely known about. In healthy psychological development, pure and senex exist in creative tension. The senex provides the container within which the pure's energy can become something that lasts. The pure provides the energy without which the senex's structures calcify into rigidity. When this polarity collapses, when the pure completely dominates, the senex does not disappear. It goes into the shadow, where it becomes not wisdom in its constructive form but depression, bitterness, the sour cynicism that often overtakes the aging eternal youth who discovers, somewhere in his 40s, that infinite potential has produced, in practice, very little that lasted. There is a culturally specific pressure that amplifies pure psychology in the present moment. The entire apparatus of contemporary entrepreneurial culture, optionality, pivoting, the serial founder, is, in structural psychological terms, a large-scale endorsement of pure psychology. The language of startups and the language of the pure are nearly identical: vision, disruption, the perpetual beginning. The language of continuation, the unglamorous work of sustaining something past the point where the initial excitement has been consumed, is structurally absent from the culture's celebration of entrepreneurship. Alex's archetypal pattern has been consistently validated by a culture that reads it as excellence rather than as a developmental situation with consequences. Return to Alex. He is 38, which means the pure archetype has been organizing his adult life for approximately 2 decades, for the entirety of his professional and relational history. The pattern is, by now, deeply grooved in ways difficult to see from inside it precisely because they have always been present and have always felt like character rather than pattern. 38 is a specific age in the developmental map that Jungian analysis takes seriously for structural reasons. Jung's framework of individuation locates the middle of life as a critical threshold, not a crisis that arrives from outside, but a turning point in which the psychological strategies that organize the first half of life begin to encounter their own inherent limits. The first half of life is appropriately outward-facing, the construction of a career, relationships, a social identity. But at some point, the psyche begins to press from a different direction, from what has not yet been attended to, from the dimensions of the self that the outward orientation has been neglecting. The individuation process is not something the conscious ego plans. It happens to the ego, often as pressure, often as dissatisfaction, often as the growing sense that the strategies that worked are no longer sufficient. For Alex, this pressing is already present. though he currently experiences it as restlessness rather than as a call. The companies are not satisfying him in the way the first one did. The restlessness is arriving earlier in each cycle now. The relationships, even in their early intensity, carry a quality of repetition he is increasingly unable to ignore. Not repetition of circumstance, but repetition of internal experience. The same walls closing in, the same unlocatable recession. What the Jungian framework offers Alex is not a prescription for how to stay in things. It is a reframing of what the flight response actually is. The walls closing in sensation he experiences when a commitment begins to deepen and define itself is not evidence that the commitment is wrong for him. It is evidence that he is standing at a specific threshold between the puer's register and the adult register, between the world of infinite potential and the world of actual existence. That threshold always feels like death to the puer-identified psyche. This is not a metaphor. It is a psychological report. The puer's identity is constituted by potential, and at the threshold, potential is precisely what is being asked to give way. What von Franz argued, and this is the pivotal clinical insight, is that the developmental movement the puer needs to make is not away from the archetype's qualities, but through them. The vision, the genuine enthusiasm, the resistance to routinization, these are not what needs to be abandoned. What is needed is the addition of the complementary principle, the willingness to allow something to be formed by duration, to discover what a relationship or a project becomes when it is not abandoned at the first appearance of definition. Alex does not need to become a different person. He needs to discover what exists on the other side of the walls closing in sensation, something that cannot be argued into existence through analysis and cannot be accessed by any means other than staying long enough to find out. One might ask, without judgment, as a genuine inquiry, whether any significant commitment one has made has ever been allowed to reach the point where the initial excitement had fully passed. Not whether one has stayed in things technically. Many people stay in things while remaining psychologically elsewhere. But whether one has stayed through the passage from the energy of the beginning to the harder, quieter thing that comes after the beginning has been consumed. If the honest answer is that it is difficult to recall an example, that difficulty is worth sitting with. One might also examine whether the cultural frameworks shaping one's understanding of freedom and ambition have been, in the Jungian sense, puer frameworks, organized around optionality, the preservation of maximum future possibility, the maintenance of the position of not yet committed. The valorization of non-commitment in contemporary culture is a real phenomenon with real psychological consequences. Contemporary culture has, to a significant degree, collectively identified with the puer archetype, convinced itself that freedom means the refusal of the definite, that maturity is a form of deadening. Jung's framework does not endorse that reading. It suggests that the archetype which feels like freedom, when it becomes the only available mode, is a very particular form of unfreedom. The freedom to begin, endlessly, and the inability to inhabit any of the things that beginning was supposed to be in service of. The counterweight to the puer is not the gray resignation of the cynics. It is the discovery, which can only be made by staying, that depth has a quality that breadth cannot replicate by accumulation, that the 10th year of something contains dimensions of experience categorically unavailable in the first, that there is a self that only comes into existence through duration. That self is not the enemy of the puer's gifts. It is the only thing that can give those gifts genuine weight. Alex is still 38. That is not an observation about urgency. Jung's framework does not traffic in urgency, and the individuation process does not run on timelines that can be pressured from outside. It is an observation about possibility. The developmental movement the puer archetype eventually requires is not foreclosed at 38 or 48 or later, but it does not happen through insight alone, however precise the insight. It happens through the sustained encounter with what emerges on the other side of the impulse to leave, through the willingness to remain in the room after the walls have begun to close in, and to discover, over time, that what was felt as the death of the self was the threshold to a different kind of self, one that can only be built by staying. There is something on the other side of the walls. The Puer has never stayed long enough to see what it is. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if this conversation is one you want to continue. There is considerably more to examine in this series, and the examination does not accelerate by rushing.